Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom where we're going to pick right where we left off in class today talking about the European Middle Ages, right? Like now, again, big thing I got to go ahead and put out there. It's not my favorite stuff to talk about. I know Sydney today and I had a long talk about it and we were just like, yeah, this stuff is like it's like a little all over the place. It's confusing. The biggest thing you need to understand about the Middle Ages is the fact that it's just a transitional time period, right? It's this giant gap of time from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance that we need to understand simply because it's going to create some big traditions in Europe, right? It's going to kind of outline the languages that they speak. It's going to outline the countries that they lived in. It's going to outline some of the governmental system structures like kings and queens and ideas of that going forward are going to be enduring factors in European history going forward that are just going to always exist, right? Just kind of like an enduring factor is just how much I think y'all are amazing, right? How just I think A period is just top notch. Where it's at, y'all make me so happy all the time whenever I get a chance to teach you.
Oh, God.
So yeah, exactly. So just let's do this thing together, right? Let's support each other in this, and let's try to make this as interesting as a unit as we possibly can, right? And I tell you what, just for all you guys, especially shout out to Elena because I know she's a big fan, right? Oh, come here, Pee-Pee. Yes, here's Pee-Pee. All right, so now look, don't you love the Middle Ages, Pee-Pee? Oh no, but he is a barbarian in and of himself, right? So we did leave off in class talking about barbarians, right? We started talking about barbarians and how y'all don't speak the same language as everybody else does, and everyone thinks you're uncivilized and stuff like that. But you're not that uncivilized, Pee-Pee. Barbarian actually just comes from Latin, barbar, which means that you don't speak the same language as me, and that's okay, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we left off talking about this, right? We talked about how barbarians were not actually that uncivilized. They were just a tribal people, right? Y'all closed your eyes. We imagined what it would be like to walk through Rome, and then we imagined what it would be like to walk into a barbarian village, right? The barbarian village was like huts and tents, and they're semi-nomadic, right? And that the early Middle Ages is kind of just very well known for the consolidation of some of these barbarian tribes into areas that you now consider modern-day places in Europe, right? Like places like, for example, the Ostrogoths are going to settle Italy, right? You're going to see the Franks settle France, the Angles settle England, right? The Visigoths are going to go over and settle Spain. And remember, barbarians don't look like this, right? And they also show up and they migrate looking for land and resources and places to farm and stuff like that. They don't look like that. They actually just kind of tend to look kind of like this, right? Which is just going to be a little bit more simplistic and stuff like that. Now, look at the big thing about it. Don't judge the barbarians. Let's not call them dumb anymore. It's not really the nice way of going about things. It's more along the lines of they're just resetting. You're not dumb, Pee-Pee. You're just resetting. You're just not as advanced as the Romans or my A period or people like me. So the thing about it, though, in general, is barbarians had kings and governments. Kinda, right? Like eventually they will, right? That'll evolve into different, legislative bodies will pop up in England around the 1200s, right? The parliament's gonna show up there. You're gonna see, parlements being established in, Middle Ages France, right? You're gonna see legislative bodies showing up in that sense. Advisories to kings and queens, nobles, and different social classes will pop up eventually. They're gonna show up with money down the road, eventually once they get to a point where they can actually have their own government and economic systems, and they're also going to settle all of Europe and be the origin of its modern day people. Pee-Pee, it's going to be okay. It's going to get there eventually. You're just going through a dark age right now, Pee-Pee. You're just a really rough dark age, right? Now, really quickly, though, a lot of, Middle Ages historians hate referring to the Middle Ages as a dark age, right? But the big thing about it in general is you just got to understand that the thing about it is these barbarian invasions are really going to define the early Middle Ages, right? From Asia, you're going to see the Huns and the Magyars come in that way, which they're going to settle Russia and most of Eastern Europe. And the Germanic Northerners are going to show up and they're going to begin to migrate in, and that's the Saxons and the Angles and the Goths that are going to start displacing a lot of different people and creating new settlements throughout most of Europe, right? Now, we have multiple types of Goths, right? We've got Visigoths and Ostrogoths, and you can actually see that in this list as well. You're going to see the Ostrogoths settle the Italian peninsula. The Visigoths are going to settle what is now modern-day Spain. The Angles and Saxons are going to create what is now modern-day Britain, and the Franks, that are going to be an offshoot of some of these Goths, are going to create the big area in Central Europe, right? So the thing about it, though, is these are the Germanics, right? The Germanics are beginning to show up, and their language is beginning to blend with what is left over from the Roman Latin, and they're starting to ow, that hurt. Don't bite me. Now, they're beginning to do all this other different stuff, and they're beginning to create new settlements, and they're blending their culture with what is left over to be Roman culture, right? Because it's a very important thing that you understand. The Romans just didn't vanish, you know what I mean? Just because Rome fell in 476 and because Rome was chaotic and went downhill, you have to understand that that doesn't mean that all the settlements just went away or that Roman cities just left, right? For example, the original settlement of what was now London was originally a Roman city known as Londinium, right? Like, so it was originally a Roman city, and the barbarians are just going to take it over, and they're just going to create their own city out of it, right? And they're going to rename it as London, right? So, for example, Paris is not named after the Greek god Paris figure. It's actually named after the Pari, or the Pari, which is a tribe of barbarians that lived in that area, and that's why they called it Paris. See, he's not really aggressive if I cover his eyes and stuff like that. He can't really see anything, and so he's actually very docile. He's more like a bird right now. But if I let go or whatever, he's just going to like start looking around, and he's going to start trying to lick everybody. See? What I tell you. Now, the big thing about it is, though, PP, you got to understand where these barbarians are going. At any given time, you're going to need to be able to answer or make a list of different barbarian tribes in Europe, right? Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Huns, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Franks, and so like the Franks and stuff like that. And eventually, another little thing too, the Angles and the Saxons are actually going to breed together eventually under this guy named Alfred the Great, and they're going to make these people called Anglo-Saxons, right? Which then later on, like I said, they're going to settle the land that is now known as England, right? Angleland, land of the Angles, Angland, right? Like so now, going forward though as well, you got to understand that the barbarians are just going to organize. You don't need to necessarily write that down though. All this stuff is going to be kind of obvious, right? The barbarians are going to organize and they're going to start creating their different in their own unique countries, right? So the thing about it is the very first country or very first kingdom to actually pop up since the fall of Rome is going to be this place known as the Frankish kingdoms, right? The Frankish kingdom is going to show up and they're going to create basically the very first kingdom since Rome, okay? And they're going to start showing up right around the fall, after the fall of Rome, right? Right around the mid 500s to 600s AD, right? They're going to take over a land that looks kind of like this area, right? So now this is going to be at its height, though. That's going to be around like 800 AD that's going to create itself. But originally, the Frankish kingdom like took over what is now modern-day France, right? So going forward, you have to understand, though, is that key idea of consolidation still, right? Are other people going to come along and figure out how to do this stuff? Are they going to come along and lead these people and kind of consolidate them into one area, right? Audrey gets this. I don't know why, but today and Audrey, when we were going back and forth, Audrey like understood what we were getting at with this consolidation element, right? Well, one of the earliest people that comes along and decides to consolidate some of these barbarians together is a man by the name of Clovis, right? Now, Clovis is going to live to about 511 AD. He's born in 466, which means actually, one, this guy didn't live to be very, very old. He actually died like in his, what is that, your 40s, right? Like so. And the other big thing that you need to understand is that he was alive when Rome fell, right? This dude was 10 years old when Rome went downhill, but he is going to become the very first king of Europe, right? The very first king of Europe that pops up since the fall of Rome. And he's very, very famous for one particular reason. He consolidates the Franks together, and he is considered the founder of the French monarchy, right? So when we look at his name, you can actually see his name in modern-day French history and in the studies of different languages, as well as in the studies of French history, right? So Clovis was his name, but later on, what ended up happening is they ended up changing his name, and most kings of France are going to be named after him, right? Except what they did is they just dropped the C, and they turned the V into a U. So you ended up with kings named Louis, right? Louis, not Louis, right? Don't be all English about this and say Louis. They're going to end up changing the name Clovis to the name Louis, right? And Louis is a very, very prominent name, and there were 18 different Louis in like French history and 18 different monarchs all named Louis, right? So the thing about it is you can even see his impacts on just the names of these different people. And that is actually why Louisiana is named Louisiana. Without Clovis, we wouldn't have had French kings named Louis, and of course now we have Louisiana, the land of Louis. But that's specifically Louis XIV, if you're actually curious about who that is that we're talking about in that sense, right? So the thing about it, though, is he is the amalgamation of the name Louis. He's why the later on kings are going to be named Louis, right? So going into it, though, you have to understand he establishes that first kingdom, right? The first kingdom to pop up since the fall of Rome. And he leads what is known as the Frankish kingdom, right? So with that, though, big thing we understand about him is he might have just been like a Roman military leader, right? Really, really quick thing. Big thing we need to understand. Only 2% of people could read and write during this time period. So Haley Ruther, do we know a ton about this guy? That's right, Haley Ruther. We don't, right? We don't know loads and loads and loads about this man. But we do know, like, we can conjecture things, right? We can believe that he probably might have been a Roman military figure, might have actually been in control of a leftover Roman army since the fall of Rome, or one of the ones that was kind of scattered out into the wilderness and stuff like that. Well, one thing he's going to do, though, is he's going to come to conquer, or like he's going to come into power over a large military. And he's going to conquer many other smaller competing tribes around his area. For example, like the Pari, right? The Pari, which will actually be later on where they named and found the city known as Paris, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is he conquers a bunch of these competing tribes and the regional Roman political leaders, and he creates the very first kingdom since the fall of Rome, the first large area or landholding. And basically what he's done is he's just created a consolidated barbarian territory, right? Another big thing that he's going to do as well, though, is he's going to convert to Catholic Christianity. Something you need to write down and something you need to understand, and something that's going to be on your quiz when you come back. That's right. We have a quiz when you come back that's going to be on this flip, okay? So be ready for that, all right? This is going to be an important word that you need to understand, too. It's going to be kind of almost like a fill-in-the-blank word. Before Clovis decided to convert to Christianity, he was what is known as a pagan, right? Like, so pagan is spelled P-A-G-A-N, I believe, anyway. You can double-check that or whatever. But pagan is a loose term that almost any historian of European valor or European credentials uses to refer to somebody who is polytheistic, right? Now, particularly naturalistic polytheistic, not necessarily just Roman polytheistic, but like they're guys that basically believe that gods were represented in nature and things like that, right? So he was a pagan before he ever became a Christian. But why would this guy convert to Catholic Christianity? What would be his motive? What's his idea? Why would he do this entire thing? What's the point, right? Well, a lot of it has to do with his wife, right? His wife actually came up to him and was like, hey, Clovis. You know that religion that's spreading super, super fast ever since Constantine legalized it in Rome? That thing, Christianity, right, where Christ apparently saved everybody for their sins and stuff. It's appealing a lot to your people, and a lot of people are beginning to gravitate towards it, and a lot of people are starting to convert to Christianity. Like this guy, John, who's really goofy looking, that lives down the street. He looks kind of like Patrick Star and stuff like that. He's got eyeballs on the side of his head. He even converted to Christianity because they have Christmas and all these other benevolent things, and they have a heaven and a place where you can go if you do what you're supposed to, right? So if you convert, Clovis, and become a Christian, you'll be able to have more power over your people. Clovis originally looked at his wife and said, no, I like being a pagan. I like having all my gods and my animal sacrifice and doing all these different things, right? So I'm just going to stay this way. Well, his wife eventually looks at him and is like, fine, you want to play that way? Your son will take over after you die. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to convert him without you asking. And so like what she ends up doing is she goes off and baptizes one of his sons, his eldest son, that would actually one day actually succeed him as king if he lived. But there was an infection in the baptismal water and some type of bacterium, and the kid got sick and died, right? And so Clovis was like, I'm definitely not converting to this voodoo now. And so she was like, okay, that was just a practice run. She takes his next son, tries to get him baptized, and that kid almost dies, right? But after a lot of convincing, right, he eventually does convert to Catholic Christianity, and he adopts this new system so he can actually extend his power and control, now having a unified people under a unified church, right? And what he began when he did this was this thing known as the Merovingian dynasty, right? Now, that is his last name, and y'all know what dynasties are after we studied Egyptian history and Egyptology and stuff like that. Dynasties are literally ruling bodies of families, right? He goes off to this place called Reims, and in the city of Reims, R-E-I-M-S, he is literally converted to Christianity, and he becomes the king of the Franks, right? So with that, though, in his Merovingian dynasty, his sons and descendants would later on take up hold from underneath him, right? He's considered the founder of France, and he is also the very first person to create the empire, country, territory area since the fall of Rome. And actually, you can see in his symbol right here, the fleur-de-lis, which is actually not something he came up with necessarily. The fleur-de-lis was actually co-opted much later. He didn't use the fleur-de-lis. A later king of France did, and his name was Louis XII, was one that is actually why it's called fleur-de-lis, because it literally means flower of Louis. But regardless, he's still a French monarch. He's still the first one. So in this modern interpretation of what we think Clovis might have looked like, he's holding a fleur-de-lis because he's that first French king, right? Because he converted to Christianity, and the fleur-de-lis represents the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? So with that, though, he's creating that very first territory since the fall of Rome, right? Now, this is what we're looking at, though, okay? And this is the kind of the area that he created, that Frankish kingdom in 768, right? Now, going into it further, though, next, there's going to be somebody else that pops up, right? Now, this is important to understand really quick because he's somebody that you learn about that not everybody else learns about, right? We got this guy named Charles Martel, a.k.a. known as Charles the Hammer Martel, right? So with that, you need to understand Charles Martel, not a king of Europe. He's actually this guy known as the mayor of the palace, right? So in the Merovingian dynasty, right? And if you need a better understanding to understand this, I'm dropping a little, a video down in the description below that talks a lot about Charlamagne, and it kind of will bring up this idea of the mayor of the palace and stuff like that, right? Well, what ended up happening, though, was that the Merovingian kings did have some power. But the person that had the most power inside the Frankish kingdom was a person that was in this position known as the mayor of the palace, kind of like an assistant to the king. And this dude shows up named Charles Martel. And Charles Martel gets a nickname known as the Hammer because of his hard work as mayor of the palace, his guidance of other kings, and as well because he hammered the Muslims back down into Spain, right? Now, this is an interesting little thing you need to understand. This is that the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel apparently prevented Muslims from coming up through southern Spain and pushing into what was known as the Frankish kingdom. The Battle of Tours is where he literally hammered them back down into Spain and created a much more like Eurocentric and Frankish kingdom that would be ruled over Frankish people. And this is a very famous picture of the Battle of Tours right here. You can actually see these different ideas and these different elements because he is actually fighting right here on the back of this horse, this white steed that represents his purity and also his Christianity, and also behind him you see the cross. And he's fighting against these people right here, these Muslim invaders and stuff like that, which this is a very racist picture, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later on as time goes on, who are attacking these innocent women and children right here, right? But the thing that you need to understand is this is, of course, a loaded image, right? And it's trying to show the superiority of Christianity over Islam, but as we know, that's not really how this works. But what we do need to know is that Charles Martel did kind of create a line right where Spain was, and it allowed the Frankish kingdom to keep growing. And what it did is it actually grew in this direction rather than going down into Spain. But Charles Martel actually created this entire system. And he kind of created more of like Spain was an area where like Muslims would actually live should they so choose. And you can actually still see a lot of Muslim architecture down in that area of Spain. This actually right here is closer to Andalusia, which is actually in southern Spain. It's a Muslim mosque and prayer temple that is actually down there. And so with that though, Charles Martel created a very, very large area where his family becomes very powerful and very prominent. And his family eventually ends up creating this thing known as the Carolingian dynasty, right? And after the Merovingians die out, Charles Martel's family ends up taking over because he hammered those people down into Spain and allowed the Frankish kingdom to continue to grow. Well, his sons, okay, and his later descendant, Charlamagne, would take up his steed and actually create himself as a very important figure, right? Charlamagne is a very important figure that you need to understand. And in that video, it talks a lot about him, right? So Charlamagne is a very powerful leader, very strong Christian, and very intense figure that actually picked up the mantle after Charles Martel, right? And he creates this thing known as the Carolingian Empire, modeled off of Charles Martel's last name and the Carolingian dynasty, right? So as Clovis's last name was Merovingian, Charlemagne's last name is Carolingian, and that is the dynasty that he begins. And he expands off Merovingian success, and he creates a large family rulership. Charlamagne, when we're looking at his name, you have to understand that he did such a good job that he earned this title, right? Charlamagne, the back end of his name, literally means the Great. So literally he's being referred to as Charles the Great, or in Latin, Carolus Magnus is what he's referred to as well. Well, Carolus Magnus is very, very well known for doing a lot of very important things, including the fact that he literally was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. Why was he crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III? Because he did a lot of very, very important things, right? Most importantly, he crossed the Alps, just like Hannibal did, and saved Pope Leo from Viking invasion and also from being attacked by outside armies and empires, right? And because of this, because he saved the Pope at the time, Leo III, he will be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, right? But wait a second. The Holy Roman Empire is not necessarily holy. It's not in Rome, and is it necessarily an empire? Well, not really. It's just a big middle chunk of Europe where all of this stuff is going to be taking place. And it's basically the very first place that actually took shape after the fall of Rome. And it's going to be all this stuff right here. And since it now connects with Rome a little bit because he actually created a system where he saved the Pope, they refer to this place as the Holy Roman Empire. And so they refer to the guy that leads it as the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charlemagne's the first one, right? He's the very first Holy Roman Emperor, okay? And he is known as the father of modern-day Europe because he created a large political infrastructure underneath him, and he united different barbarians and tribes in Western Europe, and he also fended off a very large amount of Viking invaders, right? And we'll talk about the Vikings here in about 2 seconds, okay? But the big thing you need to understand, though, is he unites a bunch of these barbarian tribes together, consolidates them further, and creates that very first Holy Roman Empire, and extends the Frankish kingdom even further after his actual ancestor, Charles Martel, and I think it's his dad, but I just don't want to commit to that yet, Charles Martel actually created that line where the Spain would stay Muslim territory and the Frankish kingdom would begin to expand eastward, right? Now, with that, though, also, you have to understand he created this other thing known as Carolingian Renaissance, right? Really quickly, what is a renaissance? It's a rebirth of something, right? It means that intelligence or something is coming back, right? So underneath Charlamagne, he's going to have a very large prominence where he's going to encourage the study of reading and writing, okay? Remember, in the Middle Ages, only about 2% of people could read and write. Well, Charlamagne is actually going to take that level from 2% to 4%, right? And I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's doubling the number of people that can read and write. And he basically says that if you want to advise me, or if you want to help me, or if you want to help me extend these lands any further, you better know how to read and write. And another thing that's going to come out of the Carolingian Renaissance is this thing known as Carolingian minuscule, right? And Carolingian minuscule is the writing system that we use today. It's the modern era writing system where we have capital and lowercase letters, right? We have these different ways of referring to proper nouns with capital letters, and that's going to come to power and come to adoption under Charlamagne. So let's take a mental accounting of what this guy did. He actually extended the empire even further after the death of Clovis and after his father Charles the Hammer Martel pushed the entirety of the Muslims back down into Spain, right? He is going to extend the Frankish kingdom even further. He's going to save the Pope from being destroyed by Viking invasion and outside tribes. He's going to take over a lot of other Vikings and beat them in many different wars. He's going to be a very strong Christian leader, and he's even going to create more important ideas of reading and writing. So I'd say Charlamagne kind of earned the title of being called Carlos Magnus or Charles the Great, right? Even though he had a lot of people killed and executed because they wouldn't convert to Christianity. But we're not going to get into that right now, okay? So like now, because he's not like the best person in that sense, right? But the conquest of Charlamagne can actually be seen right there. Now, a big thing that I did just say, though, and I did just bring up, is these people known as the Vikings, right? Now, the Vikings are people that Carlos Magnus, that Charlamagne had to constantly deal with, right? Because during the 700s period, right around the 700s to about the 9 to like 1000s AD, during the early Middle Ages, you're going to see the growth of this culture of people, known as the Vikings, right? Now, some of you probably think you've heard of these Vikings before, right? Well, let's take 2 seconds and kind of quantify what you think you know about the Vikings. A lot of you, when you think Viking, you think of this.
It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast.
This was going to be the most exciting voyage of our lives.
Holy victory! Or death!
Yeah, exactly, right? You think of really intense scenes with guys with horns and rah. Now, there's elements of their society that are still there that are prominent, right? The thing you do need to understand is there is one thing that this assessment or this assumption of Vikings does get accurate, right? They are a warrior culture, and they're originally from a place known as Scandinavia. Scandinavia includes modern-day Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the northern territories and areas of Europe, right? The Viking culture that is very warrior-based is very well known for a lot of different things. For example, using these things called Viking longships to go on these things that are prominently known as raids, right? That right there is a Viking warship, and they were very well known as raiders of Europe, right? They showed up and they took over towns and villages and cities, but had no intention of taking land or creating settlements right there, right? They actually were very well known as for raiding because they would show up, take your stuff, take your food, take your goods, and sometimes take your women, and then go back to Scandinavia with them and celebrate their spoils of war, right? You know Viking culture as well because they are going to establish early settlements throughout Europe in the sense of like around like Iceland and towards Greenland a little bit later on, and they're also going to create some other establishment areas in modern day Denmark and places like Copenhagen and areas like that are going to be original Viking settlements, right? Now, another big thing you have to understand is they actually were the very first people to discover North America. Out of all the Europeans, they were the very first ones to step foot onto North America. A guy named Leif Erikson was the guy that actually did it because he's the son of this dude named Eric the Red. And Leif Erikson is a very famous figure, and he's even brought up in SpongeBob.
Hey, everybody! It's Leif Erikson Day! Hinga-dinga-durgan!
Yeah, that guy that like SpongeBob right there is alluded to is the very first Viking leader that actually like stepped foot in North America and stuff like that. Now, these raids, though, are very important as well, just like their culture is very important to the establishment of European tradition, right? For example, all the days of the week in our calendar are named after Viking gods and goddesses, right? For example, Monday is Monday is the moon's day. Sunday is the sun's day. Saturn is Saturday is literally actually Saturn's day. It was actually an attribution to the old Roman gods and kind of a tip of the cap to them. But my favorite ones include the fact that you also have people like Tuesday is Tyr's Day, their god of war. Their raids would always start on Tuesdays. Wednesday is Woden's Day or Odin's Day, the father of their gods and stuff like that. And Thursday is the one you probably know the best, Thor's Day, right? Thor, very, very prevalent as a Marvel superhero and stuff like that, is the god of thunder and lightning in the Viking culture, and he literally has movies about him made now.
Tell me, brother, what were you the god of again?
I know, man. It's crazy. Viking culture is everywhere in so many different ways. Also, fun fact, ladies, I know a lot of y'all are probably sitting there being like, ugh, I don't want a Viking god to come and steal me away when I'm living in Europe. Girls, I hate to break it to you, but they're actually the cleanest men in all of Europe during this time period. Some of the biggest artifacts that they've ever found is actually like combs and hair washing utensils and like things that they actually use to clean themselves with, because they had one day a week where they specifically made sure to like clean themselves to help prevent disease and stuff like that. I know, it's wild, isn't it? So the thing about it though, in general though, is their raids are still very important, because these raids are going to lead to people being in Europe being very scared. People that lived under Charlamagne were very, very worried constantly of Viking intervention and Viking raids. And what is this going to lead you to do? Probably to create a system that might keep you safe from these raids, should they actually happen. And what that system was known as is called feudalism, right? Feudalism is very important because these raids that are going on throughout Europe is going to scare and freak a lot of people out, right? One of the most prominent raids actually happened in the 700s AD when the Vikings actually stormed an area in northern Europe and destroyed a monastery, took all the artifacts from that monastery, and then also killed all the monks that lived there, right? And so this is going to scare people. They're even going to threaten Constantinople one time and invade there. They're going to threaten the Pope and stuff like that, and it's going to lead to Charlemagne coming in and backing him up. They're going to invade this northern area right there, threatening the Holy Roman Empire. And like I said in that video down in the description, you don't have to watch it, but if you want to watch it, it'll help kind of connect all these dots as well. Now, this invasion, though, is going to lead to a lot of people being very scared that they're going to show up at any minute. And so this feudal system is very, very important. So do me a favor and just put feudal system equals. There's 3 things that the feudal system did, okay? The feudal system is a system of land ownership, social classes, and then also protection, right? So what the feudal system turned into was a system where people owned large plots of land, could actually use it to create different social classes and social order, and then also protection to keep people safe from Viking raids and other barbarians out there, right? So something you need to understand is that every single one of these feudal systems is ruled over by a king, right? Your guys like Clovis, your Charlemagnes, your other different area people as well, like Pepin is another one that shows up, and a dude named Pippin later on that is actually the son of Charlemagne, right? So now the big thing about it, though, you got to understand is that king actually gave land and plots of land to very, very powerful and wealthy people at the top of this entire social class system. Every one of these triangles is a plot of land, not a pot of gold, a plot of land, right? And each plot of land was ruled over by a lord or a noble. You know lords and nobles already. They're just referred to as dukes and earls and barons and like people like that own these large chunks of land. Those lords and nobles keep this entire feudal system going. And each plot of land they own is called a fief, spelled F-I-E-F, fief. Make sure you know that word, okay? Now, going forward, the lords and nobles need people there to keep the land safe. And those people are known as vassals or knights that actually are fully armored individuals with some military training that can keep the land safe from Viking invasions and keep it safe from outside barbaric tribes, right? And then you have the people at the very, very bottom, the peasants at the very bottom, known as serfs, right? Something you need to understand about serfs, though, is that they are not slaves. Well, they kind of are, but they're not slaves in the conventional sense, right? They're not necessarily owned by the lords and nobles, but they are bound to the land by a contract, right? There is a document that they have to sign that says that they will work for a certain amount of time on that land and provide their labor so they are allowed to stay there, right? Because the serfs are too poor to pay rent, but they must actually sign the document. They are bound to that land, and so they're basically debt slaved, right? And we saw this in ancient Athens, right? We saw it with the Horus Stone and stuff like that. This is a pattern that societies go through. And also, that's why in the modern era, people, when you lease an apartment or when you create an apartment, you have to sign a contract saying, I will live here for X amount of time and pay my rent. That's why the person that owns your property is known as your landlord, right? Like, so it actually relates to the old feudal system, right? But the serfs have to provide something to only be allowed to stay there, to receive the protection from the vassals, and to receive some land plots from the lord. They have to provide their labor. They work. They farm is their big thing, right? They farm different crops, but they mainly farm wheat and barley that is used to make breads and other kinds of staple like goods and crops, right? Now, the vassals provide military service. Now, notice really, really quickly, I got two arrows right here. During times of peace, where the country is not going to war, the vassals provide service to the lords and nobles to keep the land safe. But if a king ever wants to go to war, he calls the lords and says, send me your vassals. And they all show up with their armies, they mush them all together, the king goes out and fights a war, right? That's where the vassals are actually relating to the king as well. And then last but not least, your lords pay your taxes, right? Lords pay taxes to keep that land and keep it all like kind of within the reach of the king. And also they pay the taxes to the king as a thank you and a promise for the land and title that they have received from him. But right there, y'all, that is it. That is a very intense flip, a lot of different stuff. We will talk about it a little bit more when I see you again. But remember, get ready for that quiz. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.